Hello, and welcome to the first in a series of asynchronous virtual roundtables presented to you by the Northwestern University Transportation Center and dealing with transportation, logistics, and supply chain networks under COVID-19. I'm Hani Mahmassani. I'm director of the Transportation Center, and I will be your moderator. So the first one in this series deals with supply chain disruptions and industry challenges. It features three prominent leaders in the field of transportation, logistics, and supply chain management. We will start with Professor Sunil Chopra, who's a distinguished professor in the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern, and a well-known author and the leader in education and research in supply chain management. We will also hear from Mr. Eugene Soroka, who is the executive director of the Port of Los Angeles, the busiest container port in North America. And we'll also hear from Mr. Doug Wagner, who is CEO and chairman of the board of Echo Global Logistics, a leading 3PL company, again, in North America. So with that, let me tell you a little bit more about the format. This is an asynchronous roundtable, and it's virtual, meaning that the discussions with these individuals have taken place at different times, and they are being brought together through this series. And at the end of the question and answer period that I will be moderating with these individuals, you, the audience, will have the opportunity to ask questions. But we ask that you ask your questions via chat as opposed to via voice. And so throughout, please leave your questions through chat. We will be moderating this list, and then at the end, we will have, some of these questions will be put to me, and I will do my best to answer those for you on behalf of the presenters. But also, in some instances, the speakers themselves will be present with us in real time, and then we will direct the questions to them. And so, without further ado, we will turn it over to our first speaker, and that's Professor Sunil Chopra. So, Sunil, you're one of the leading authorities on supply chain management and logistics, the author of one of the most widely used textbooks on the subject, and a much sought after advisor to some of the world's most successful companies. You know about the concerns, of course, that disruptions such as the COVID-19 pandemic have created about companies' abilities to do business and deliver the goods under these conditions. You're also a master teacher and explainer of complicated concepts that are related to our supply chains. And so, we hear a lot these days about supply chains being vulnerable and the need for our supply chains to be resilient. Could you perhaps explain the concepts of vulnerability and resilience in the context of supply chains, and perhaps give a couple of examples of how supply chains are impacted under the current COVID-19 pandemic?
Thanks, Hani. Thanks a lot for your kind words. At the basic level, the objective of a supply chain is to effectively match supply and demand. So it is in that context I want to talk about both vulnerability and resilience. So vulnerability arises when, for one reason or the other, a supply chain is unable to match supply and demand. This happens on a regular basis because demand is fluctuating, and firms have largely figured out how to deal with that effectively. I think the challenge arises when there is a disruption that could affect supply, and in some instances, a disruption like COVID-19 that could simultaneously affect supply and demand. So let me use a couple of examples to make my point. Let's start with masks. both healthcare providers and people have been looking for masks. COVID-19 has resulted in demand for masks spiking. Simultaneously, the supply for masks, which was largely concentrated in China, actually got disrupted. So the supply chains were vulnerable to something like COVID-19 because supply got disrupted in China simultaneously as demand spiked. Now, this has happened in other supply chains where the main provider of product is China or one of the affected sites. So vulnerability, I will really define as vulnerability to a significant disruption where supply ceases and you're not able to match supply and demand for an extended period of time. Another example would be what happened with toilet paper. Now here, there's no supply problem. The factories producing toilet paper are producing toilet paper at a very steady rate. However, because demand for toilet paper is relatively predictable, supply chains have been operating efficiently without carrying a lot of excess inventory of toilet paper sitting around. So here what happened? Basically, because of the panic, some people started buying toilet paper. And we are all humans, and what you see is whenever you think there is going to be a shortage of some product, you end up trying to get more of it. So basically, we saw a surge in toilet paper demand, and we see empty toilet paper shelves, not because the supply chain is disrupted, but there is short-term panic buying. But in either case, you have some degree of vulnerability. To give you a third example of vulnerability, we heard about Amazon shutting down its Kentucky distribution center because people there, I don't know the precise number, came down with COVID-19 and they had to shut the entire center. Now, suddenly, this center, which is an important part of their distribution network, gets disrupted. But Amazon simultaneously gives you an example of how they've built resilience into this system. Mm-hmm. If that was the only center serving a large part of the country, their supply chain would have been disrupted. However, now they have close to 300 different centers, and products kept in Kentucky are also kept in other places. So there are alternative routings as well as alternative sources of supply that Amazon is able to develop. As a result, their supply chain has been resilient. To give you a last example of building resilience, and then I'll let your questions guide where I go, would be, I think it would be in Amazon's interest to now start thinking about, can we run our centers at less than 100% capacity to ensure there is enough social distancing between the workers who are there so that even if somebody falls ill, we don't necessarily have to shut down the whole center. Because when they're running at 100% capacity, people are working much closer together. So the risk of a disruption goes up. So, these are a few different ways you can think of building resilience. You can think of alternative sources of supply. You can think of making sure you have alternative routing available. You can think of running things at slightly lower capacity that improves their chances of not getting disrupted.
So you're getting into our second question here, which is how can companies make their supply chains less vulnerable and more resilient? And you have given us a few examples, but what should they be doing not only in the short term, but perhaps looking ahead at potentially new threats in the future?
Actually, to be really effective, it is long-term thinking that is most important. And here, I will use search for ventilators by the government as an example, right? Because there have been no alternative setups. So let's start with the very basic. In the context of this disruption, COVID-19, we need ventilators. I'm going to take that as a product, right? There are only two ways that we could have built some degree of resilience into the supply chain. One is to have, say, a strategic stockpile of ventilators, maybe 30 to 50,000 ventilators that are sitting in a strategic stockpile. After all, as a country, we have a strategic stockpile of crude oil, right? Which basically we started after the 1973 oil embargo. And the idea was, even if there is a serious disruption, we have enough oil to keep going for an extended period of time. So one option is to carry a lot of inventory. The challenge with that option to deal with disruption is the following. For the first 6 months after, say, COVID-19, everybody will be very comfortable with the idea of carrying 5 warehouses full of ventilators. After 2 years, somebody is going to say, why are we spending all this money carrying ventilators that we never use? So the other way you can build resilience is by having alternate production sources that are defined and available. Now, our challenge today is, the government's negotiating with companies like Ford, but there is no prior plan. A much better approach, in my opinion, is what I will call contingent sourcing, where the government, while there is no disruption, is already looking at which are the products which will be important in the event of a disruption, which are the alternative suppliers who could retool quickly. And then what the government should do is kind of buy insurance. In my opinion, the government should make a commitment that when there is a disruption, we might come to you to make 20,000 20,000 pieces of this equipment. Mm-hmm. And as insurance, we will pay you $2 million every year. And of course, we will pay you for the cost of production when that happens. So in this case, the way to think about it is you need to make sure that you have alternate sources of supply that are planned for in advance, that you don't start after the disruption hits. So again, to summarize, what I would say is the 2 basic ways you're going to build resilience is: 1, have alternate sources of supply. 2nd, have excess inventory that is sitting around.
Okay. So continuing again with that theme, do you see a role for technology in making supply chains more resilient? So everybody, of course, is hyping, their own favorite technology. But do you see the developments such as additive manufacturing, for example, or blockchain transactions as an important factor in this regard?
So I see a very big role for technology in making supply chains more resilient. And I'll give you a few different examples to point out to how information technology, let's look at flexible, you called it additive manufacturing, but flexible manufacturing technologies like 3D manufacturing, and flexible warehousing technologies, which, Flex and other companies are providing, all have a role to play. So first, let's look at information technology. Now, again, I will just go back to just imagine we had alternative sources of supply available. The important thing is we need information technology to coordinate all this, because let's look at currently, the problem is peaking in Washington and New York. Now, it's likely it will peak in other areas at different times. Now, if everybody is arranging for their individual supply of ventilators, we will need a lot of ventilators. A much more effective scheme is a more centrally coordinated scheme, which will use a lot of information technology, which looks at where the problem is peaking and makes sure the appropriate ventilators show up there. And when the problem comes down in that area, then ventilators are shifted. The idea is the same when you have alternative production sources. It is good information technology that allows you to coordinate those. Let's now come to something like 3D printing, basically very flexible technology. Very flexible technology is a very effective source of alternate production. Because normally what you want to do is you want production to be efficient, low cost. So you go to somebody who's very good at doing what you want. Maybe make ventilators, maybe make ventilator valves, because valves are something that seem to give up in these ventilators. Now, However, your regular supplier doesn't have the capacity when demand spikes. So now if you have alternate sources of supply, 3D printing is an ideal. In fact, there are two Italian guys who have a startup who basically do 3D printing. And when they realized that the major problem with ventilators was that some valve had to be changed from one patient to the next, they started using their 3D printing to come up with these valves as a supply source that didn't exist. So the value of having very flexible production technology is it can be repurposed to supply whatever is missing at the time of a disruption. The third example I want to go with is flexible warehousing. I think so just imagine that your normal warehouse, which is set up very efficiently to handle the products that flow through this, when there is a disruption, now having the capability to have a warehouse which can come online for your product in a week is a very useful capability. Now, we don't need everybody to be set up like that, but having some warehouses set up like that makes your supply chain much more resilient.
Thank you. So you've worked a lot in the past few years on the transformation of the retail industry towards the omni-channel model. Could you explain the particular vulnerabilities of that model and the extent to which this model is helping or hindering the ability of major retailers to weather the current crisis?
So I would say a well-implemented omni-channel model has the great strength that it is simultaneously efficient and resilient. So let's just look at retailers who have both supply capabilities. Again, I'll just start with both Walmart and Amazon. They have a centralized capability as well as a decentralized capability. Amazon through its Whole Food stores as the decentralized capability, and of course through its distribution centers, and similarly Walmart. Now the advantage of having this is, first, it's very difficult to disrupt their entire network because they have so many alternate ways that they can get you the product that it becomes more resilient to begin with. The thing which you will see is that the retailers that are doing the best. So for example, let's look at Nike. Nike is using its direct channel to sell shoes in China right now. And you can imagine at a time when they don't want lots of people crowding into Nike stores, having this direct channel is very powerful. Coming back to both Walmart and Amazon, the fact that they have this omni-channel structure available allows them to serve customers in any way that is most appropriate.
So leaving aside the giants, like Amazon and Walmart, looking at perhaps more, mid-size kind of, perhaps a little more focused retailers, what is sort of the game for them in terms of their omni-channel capabilities?
So actually today, I would say alternatives are beginning to develop for small and mid-sized players. So there are companies which are setting up warehousing capability, for example, in New York City. And the idea is that this warehousing capability will be used by the small and mid-sized players on an as-needed basis, largely to serve their online customers. So to me, I think, of course, Amazon offers this service to small retailers as well. But I think what is beginning to change is that you have service providers, both on the delivery side, on the information side, and on the storage and warehousing side, who are beginning to serve these small and mid-sized players. And I think that is something that is going to grow a lot, especially after disruptions like this, because that allows even small and mid-sized supply chains to become much more resilient.
Very interesting developments. So amid the turmoil and disruption, many players, of course, are struggling or will struggle, but others, will see new opportunities. Could you share perhaps your list of potential winners and losers in this environment?
So I think retailers who were selling, so I will take fashion design and apparel retailers as an example. I will take department stores as another example, who basically had a physical channel are taking a hit, which is very hard. So designers have had to shut down their retail stores in large volumes. I think this is going to push them into omni-channel retailing at a much faster pace than before. In fact, if they had a better structured omni-channel network already in place, they would have handled this disruption a lot better.
So Sunil, this has been very interesting and informative. Do you have any final thoughts or last words for us?
I would say, my final thoughts would be that everything that we have discussed is not just applicable to businesses. I think it's really applicable in terms of what the government response at different levels could be. And, if we can think now in terms of how we are going to make everything more resilient moving forward, it will save costs in the long term.
Thank you very much. And again, we very much appreciate your comments and sharing your views with us today. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much, Jean, for being with us today. I know how busy you are. You manage the most important port facility in the US, accounting for over 18%, I believe, of all containers to the US in the past year. I guess 32% if we include the San Pedro Bay Complex, which also includes the Port of Long Beach. You have many years of experience at the helm of some of the country's most important transportation companies. And of course, the Port of LA has had its share of difficulties due to labor action over the past few years. But these have all been very successfully resolved with the expectation, again, of greater throughput and ability to serve a larger number of ships. So how is the current disruption different from those previous experiences? What are you seeing about global trade and the domestic economy from your vantage point at the Port of LA? And how much of a reduction in activity are you experiencing relative to the same time last year? And would you say there's more variability in terms of container ship arrival rates at the port?
Sure, good series of questions, Hani. First and foremost, this is an extraordinary time for all of us. I don't think we've witnessed anything like this in our lifetime, a global health crisis and pandemic. It's had various effects on the Port of Los Angeles, but this is the second major shock to the supply chain system and the port in particular. The first being the trade war with China, which really created a tremendous amount of uncertainty. It took out any type of cargo flow that we were normally accustomed to managing, that we could even see down line with some of our systems that we've put in place. And with that, because so many people rushed in shipments on the import side to avoid these taxations by Washington, D.C. on the American companies that were importing, we then saw a 16.5% drop in our business in the fourth quarter of 2019, year over year. Then as we entered the beginning of the year, the COVID virus began to spread like wildfire. And we saw from the beginning of the impact to international trade, an extension of the traditional Lunar New Year in China, as workers were beginning to become infected and not able to return to the job, especially in factories and transportation. Right now, through the first quarter of the year, our business is down about 20% year on year.
Wow.
And that main reason is that the China factory base is only operating at about half of its normal capacity, even at this time. We have cross-referenced our work on the ground with contacts for many decades, with energy consumption, traffic patterns, even smog, to see what those metrics present. And they too are at about half of normal run rates. So while we're hopeful that more and more workers will be coming back, it's not going to happen overnight. And there will be a slight uptick in business as some of those factories begin their very subtle ramp up in production.
So are there any special health precautions that are being taken at the port from the standpoint of, say, processing incoming containers and ships?
Yes, we've revamped just about every regulation at the port, understanding the public health crisis that we see and what we can do to prevent further spread. Beginning with the United States Coast Guard regulations here at the port. They were updated to require incoming vessels to have their captain and medical doctor report in to the U.S. Coast Guard 96 hours or 4 days before the vessel was scheduled to arrive, to present the health disposition of their crew and themselves. Any symptoms, any concerns, et cetera, all must be transmitted in that dialogue. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, that a lack of transmission or falsified information carry both civil and criminal penalties at the federal level, mm-hmm. and have fines of up to $94,000 per incident. I can report to you today that we've had no problems with communications and no concerns with the vessel masters, captains, and doctors following the regulation. With that, we've also taken into account the work that must be done on the ground at the ports. Our longshore customs officers and others who must approach the vessel to begin the documentation and verification work also must maintain the proper physical distancing, make sure that they're wearing the necessary personal protective equipment, and new protocols for communication have been designed with the worker in mind. Also, it was brought to our attention 2 weeks ago that our longshore groups did not have the proper cleaning solution to make sure that the materials handling equipment and the communication devices were sanitized between handoffs of workers. We immediately jumped into action, and with our great partner, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, we procured 700 gallon equivalents of industrial bleach, which our hazmat team later diluted and put into 32-ounce spray bottles and distributed to the Employers Association for use across both the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. We are also using that model to share with our first responders, Los Angeles Police Department, and others. And there may even be distribution statewide, because we've been able to procure the solution and have found a way to distribute it in a very, very quick way. And so we're very proud of that work as well. But the same protocols are enforced at the dispatch level for our longshore groups and others to maintain that physical distancing, to make sure that there are no meetings or gatherings of 10 or more people. All the requirements of the CDC and the Los Angeles County Health Services groups are being put into action right here at the Port of Los Angeles.
Very impressive, very impressive. So what would you say are the most challenging aspects of the current crisis from the standpoint of the Port of LA? Is it the unpredictability or variability in the patterns of ship arrivals? Is it labor concerns, availability, health considerations? Is it difficulty of moving things off the ships and onto outbound conveyances? Because we've heard there may be some truck capacity issues. Is it the accumulation of outbound empties because of limited sailings to China? Or is it the uncertainty in the time horizon until normal operations resume, or all of the above?
All of the above, but I'll prioritize them for you, Hani. Number one is the health and safety of our workforce, our staff here at the Los Angeles Harbor Department, our citizens, neighbors, friends, and family. That's job number one. As you well know, 1 in 9 jobs in Southern California is tied to this port complex. That means about 1 million people go to work every day with a job related to this port's activities. Keeping that workforce healthy, safe, and on the job is front of mind every day for us. With the various emergency orders from California's Governor Gavin Newsom to the Los Angeles County supervisors and Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, it was clearly outlined that the supply chains must remain fluid. The ports have to be considered essential, as do our partners across the spectrum of the supply chain. And that's what we're focused on every day. The uncertainty that's been created between both the trade tariffs and now this unfortunate global pandemic are also complicating matters. But with the nation's only port community system in action and the digitization efforts that the Port of Los Angeles began undertaking 4 years ago, we have a deeper line of sight to the cargo coming in, how we can segment it, and how best we can expedite the medical supplies to our hospital and other healthcare community members. That's going to give us a distinct advantage, not commercially, but in executing what our healthcare needs are in the region.
Thank you. So, Gene, what kind of vulnerabilities are you seeing in the supply chains of your major customers? Are these aspects that the port can influence, or are they really external to the scope of your activities?
Yeah, the vulnerabilities that I see right now are all around information flow, and that's why we developed the port community system. But more than ever, warehouses being able to understand how much cargo is coming in and plan, the hospitals getting ready for those goods that they need, especially the PPEs, are all really highlighted. And we have asked our supply chain partners in every discussion, every video chat, share your information. This is not a proprietary look. It is not a competitive look. It is one to help save lives. And that is omnipresent every day in each conversation we have. What we have happening on the ground right now also is making sure that we're trying to get accurate information out to so many who are interested in our business, who utilize our port. I've authorized through our Port Police Chief, Tom Gazy, to send up drones that film our more than 7,500 acres and 43 miles of waterway, so I can get a real-time view of the activity on the port. And I can also say to you that our port's terminals have plenty of room for more cargo. Okay. We're only moving about half the amount of cargo that we did during the height of the US-China trade war. Our rail hubs, our truck gates are all operating very well and have the ability to manage more capacity. Empties have started to accumulate here, but are in no way a choke point to the system right now. There are one-off situations that we must fine-tune and make sure that our truck community has the ability to move in and out smoothly, and we're addressing those. But also, beginning tomorrow, Mediterranean Shipping Company will bring in 3 consecutive weeks 23,000 TEU vessels to help us evacuate empties and gather distressed exports, while also starting to ramp up on the phase 1 trade deal with China that has a particular interest for the agriculture and manufacturing communities. So the work is ongoing, but I see this more as a pendulum swing. We've got to get these empties back to Asia for when China is ready for their modest uptick in production. So we have those positioned for the factories. We'll have to catch a little bit more cargo as folks try to replenish some of their inventory. And we've got people on the ground through our supply chain optimization committee working on that right now. This pendulum effect will probably take place 2 more times before we get to the end of the summer, and we'll see what traditional peak season definitioning looks like at that time.
Thank you. So you've alluded to this already, Gene, but ports, of course, operate in the context of a large metropolitan area, LA in this case, which is one of the areas of great concern from the standpoint of the spread of COVID-19. What kind of coordination is the Port of LA exercising in this regard with the public sector, the city, county, and state of California?
Right. Well, as a municipal agency in the city of Los Angeles, we have had access to the best and brightest in the medical field to give us the necessary advice that we require, beginning with the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Los Angeles County Health Services, and so many others. We've employed those tactics on the ground at the recommendation of these health professionals to make sure that we are following the latest expert advice. Everything from physical distancing to personal protective equipment, cleaning solutions, time spent on what we need to do to sanitize our machinery and communications equipment, all of the above. At Mayor Garcetti's urging, I attended a discussion with Los Angeles County's top health executive, Dr. Barbara Ferrar, who gave us even more in-depth and detailed responses to the questions we had and to the best practices that we can employ. And of course, with the liaisons from county health and from the private health sector, We feel we are doing everything possible to protect our workers. But again, it is a fluid and iterative process where we're learning every day, just as the American citizen is, and we'll make sure that we keep fine-tuning those best practices.
So I believe in addition to your significant responsibilities as executive director of the port, you're now in charge of the logistics operation at the level of the city and the county. Am I correct?
Yes, that's correct. So Sunday night, Mayor Garcetti announced that I would be taking concurrent responsibility as Chief Logistics Officer for the City of Los Angeles, focused specifically on our healthcare industry and the movement of essential goods. And this will be a three-pronged approach to begin: purchase order management, supply delivery, and procurement where necessary. And the work in these areas is just beginning with our healthcare sector, but so far, I can tell you that the receptivity has been great. Our ability to bring technology into this discussion to manage purchase orders and fulfillment is going to be very, very important to the success of the program as a broader healthcare community engages with us.
Again, a very, very impressive role here that you're playing, and an extremely important one, I think, for the region and for the nation. So there's maybe a tougher question. How long do you think the current situation can continue before the Port of LA and its customers experience serious economic and financial hardship?
Well, from the Port of LA's standpoint, we have had a strong financial policy in place since our CFO, Marla Blevins, joined us nearly 5 years ago. And with the great support of the mayor and our Board of Harbor Commissioners, we are in as strong a financial position that we have been in a generation. And that will continue. We're moving about 80% of the business that we normally do. So we're able to make sure that we're keeping the business of the port and its supply chain flowing. Being able to manage revenue at 80% of normal is also going just fine right now, although of course we'd like to see our numbers higher. This is not a commercial viability discussion. We have enough cash on hand. We have a good ledger on our balance sheet. Our capital projects continue, although in those safe and healthy working environments. The state of the port is strong and will continue to be so. And even if there is a further downturn in business, we can weather this for some time as the Port of Los Angeles. The view we have right now is that the retail community is delaying, postponing, or even canceling some orders at this juncture for their next levels of fast fashion, summer goods, and even starting to look into the back to school season at this point in time. The reason there is simple. You and I are not out at the stores buying as much as we normally do, and even the online sales cannot make up for that very traditional 70% GDP that consumers make up in the United States. So many companies are looking for assistance where they can. Unfortunately, our retail and restaurant community are furloughing workers at record rates. And the experts in our financial field believe that our jobless rate will only continue to increase in this short time. We do know, though, as the medical experts continue to run to ground every opportunity to curb and ultimately eradicate this virus, that there will need to be an economic recovery. And while we stand as a leading indicator to the economy, right now it's going to be pretty soft. And the knock-on effects from both the trade war and COVID-19 will last at least through the end of this year.
So are you then anticipating perhaps a surge of incoming vessels once the situation starts normalizing again? Or do you see a slow ramp up?
At some point that will happen, Hani, but I think for the time being, it's a very slow ramp up, and it really will be dependent on the retail community and their import volumes. But again, as we get to a position where the health experts believe that our economy can start moving forward, whenever that may be, there will need to be a recovery, and there will be an expedited series of services that we at the Port of Los Angeles will have to deliver. We just don't know that time frame yet.
So you've alluded to the digitalization aspect earlier, and I'm well aware of the leadership role that you yourself and the port have played in terms of digitalizing a lot of your operations. So how has this program of digitalizing the port's operations helped in enabling the port to cope with the kind of disruptions and volatile patterns associated with the current COVID-19 crisis? And how much coordination is taking place with the ocean carrier side on one hand and sort of the rail intermodal trucking companies on the other through the port's digital platform?
I think it has put us in a position to succeed in the areas that we've just discussed of highlighting, locating, and expediting critical goods that need to move to the American consumer and to our healthcare professionals. Without this, we'd simply be looking around, trying to jump from system to system, and in a very, very unintelligible way, find out where this cargo is. I have been so very happy with our medical community of import companies that have been working with us around the clock to highlight their shipments, self-populate within the Port Optimizer, and draw our attention so we can share that information across the supply chain service providers to make sure that those containers move as swiftly as possible. I will tell you there's much more work to do in this area, but the willingness is there. And it's unfortunate at this point that we don't have more involved, but we will continue to bring everybody in that we can.
Thank you. So, Gene, this has been reassuring on one hand, and of course, sobering as well. Is there anything else you would like to add that you would like our audience to take away from this conversation?
Well, we've got a wide-reaching audience that this particular taping is intended to, and we've got the great membership that you lead at the Business Advisory Council. I'd like to make a plea to anyone who is listening. If you have some work that you can bring us in the area of personal protective equipment, latex gloves, N95 masks, and other critical medical supplies, if you have contacts in these areas or yourself can help us with these, please come to me. And we've got an email address set up at askgene@portla.org. Many of your BAC members who I've known for over a decade now, I think can be very helpful. They all have my contact information. Please get with us at the City and Port of Los Angeles, and we'll try to put our best minds together to execute on the supply chain side of what our healthcare providers need.
Thank you very much, Gene, and we wish you and the port all the best, and hopefully we will talk again under better circumstances. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this opportunity, Hani, and continued good work. Please stay safe and healthy.
Thank you. You as well.
Thank you.
So Doug, you're the CEO of Echo Global Logistics, one of the leading non-asset-based carriers, also known as brokerage firm or a 3PL logistics company. You have been a visionary for the logistics industry. You were very early to see and seize the opportunity of matching shippers with carriers and building a very successful company around this concept. So in addition to brokerage, you offer integrated logistics and transportation services on a contract basis with many large and small shippers. And you've seen it all. You have many years of experience in the transportation logistics business. You've had your share of events, disruption, crises, and so on. So I'd like to ask you, how is the current disruption different from those previous events or experiences? What are you seeing about economic activity and freight movement from your unique vantage point? And how much of a reduction in activity are you experiencing relative to the same time last year?
Yeah, well, I've been through 9/11 and I've been through, lots of different problems in my business career, but this is the first time that everybody's had to stay at home for an extended period of time. So right off the bat, it's fortunate for us that we have the technology that allows our employees to work from home, and we're probably 100% working from home right now in all 25 of our offices around the country. So it's been gratifying for me to see that we can actually do that, and the technology works, and we haven't missed a beat with our customers and with our carriers. As for the business climate, it's kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it feels a little spooky because you go outside and everybody's closed, and there's no restaurants, can't go to Starbucks, and it feels like the world's coming to an end. On the other hand, and I guess it's fortunate to be part of the supply chain industry, our truckload business has been booming. We have had literally record days the last few days, and the amazing part for me is that we're doing it remotely from home. So what we've seen is a lot of volume with full truckload, particularly as you would think about essential commodities. So food, beverage, toilet paper, any kind of consumable products that you would buy at a grocery store. Those seem to be moving in very large quantities, and we're not sure if it's a bubble or not. I would have said that it's a bubble, except that yesterday I went to the grocery store and half the shelves were bare. So, it seems like there's still a lot of resupply going on. LTL is down a little bit. And as I've talked to some LTL carriers, that seems consistent with what they're seeing in their volumes. And for us, it's basically the smaller shippers. And I think a lot of the smaller shippers have actually, temporarily closed their doors. So when we look at our data, we see fewer active shippers. Every day we count how many active shippers that we have, and that number is down. But the shippers that aren't there seem to be the smaller LTL shippers. And when you look at the overall, industries and which ones are doing well, like I said, the consumables seem to be moving quite a bit. But when you look at manufactured products or consumer electronics, some of the consumer type products, we don't see as much of that.
So I guess you're seeing more activity in some lanes as opposed to others in terms of sort of geographic patterns.
Yeah, I think this is somewhat disruptive in that the normal freight flows of commerce aren't all there, right? So you've got some lanes that are heavier than. In fact, I'll give you one quick example. We had one major retailer that called us and said, it's going to be a big couple of weeks, and we said okay, and they said in a normal week we order 250,000 cases of Gatorade. For the next 2 weeks, we're going to order 6 million each. And so you can imagine that that's a glut of Gatorade coming from those locations to that customer's distribution centers, and that changes the balance of the national network. And then there's other lanes where the commodities aren't flowing. We had over a month with very little Pacific Rim import freight, particularly from China. They weren't sending the ships, and now, as I understand it, that freight's on the way and arriving. And so that's another factor that can imbalance kind of the national network.
So companies like Amazon and Walmart, we hear, are recruiting large numbers of employees to keep up with the demand surge on their products that you mentioned. Is that impacting the trucking industry in general and your operations in particular?
I don't think so. I mean, everything that Amazon ships starts as a full container load or a truckload somewhere, and we participate in some of that. But it does seem like the market's in a little bit tight right now. I think there's some truck drivers that don't want to go too far from home. Tough for truck drivers to get a meal, frankly, when they're out on the road. And there does seem to be high volumes in certain areas. We don't feel the Amazon impact that much, so I'm sure there's an effect there. It just doesn't happen to affect Echo.
So where do you see the most critical vulnerabilities in our existing supply chains? Are you concerned more about like nodes, warehouses shutting down, say because of contamination concerns, or labor getting sick, or are there more issues with finding carriers for the loads that shippers want to move?
Well, we've seen that the delay time for truckers to make their deliveries at warehouses has gone up exponentially. In some cases, particularly grocery warehouses, there's half-mile long lines just to get there. And part of the problem is that there's no lumpers. So the warehouses themselves who hire temporary labor to help unload the trucks, and they don't want the drivers on their dock because of health reasons.
Yep.
But they can't bring the lumpers in either, or the lumpers aren't available. So there's been a lot of delay times. Plus, you've got these warehouses are prioritizing commodities between essential and non-essential. And in many cases, their warehouses are full, so they have no place to put the freight. So you've got some drivers that are being told, come back in 4 days. Well, that doesn't work for a truckload driver who's got a load temporarily occupying his trailer. So we're seeing a lot of warehouse congestion and a lot of slowdowns, and that's starting to get priced into the mix because those deliveries that are difficult, the truckers will want extra money to make those deliveries, and they want some assurances that they can get their load delivered.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So how do you then work with your customers, your shippers and carriers in times like this? How important is it to maintain communication channels open with your shipper and carrier partners?
Well, it's very important, and we always hear in this industry about the technology, and the technology is important. If it weren't, I wouldn't have 2,600 employees, moving all these loads from their home. So the technology is definitely a factor, but I would say in these times, the human element is just as important as ever, and it's the ability to talk to a shipper, to assure them that you can get an appointment time, make the delivery, work with the driver, work with the dispatcher, iron out all these little problems that happen to come up in times like these. And so that personal touch and the human interaction is a vital important. And it's also in times like these, we found in the past that when, from these moments of crisis, grow great loyalties. So, we'll bail a customer out of a tough situation, like this customer that wants to go from 250,000 cases to 6 million cases. Mm-hmm. When you come through for them, they remember that. And at some other point in the market when the conditions are different, they'll treat you better and or give you a preferential treatment. So I always believe in the relationship, and as much as we try to automate things and use algorithms to run our business, the human element and the human relationship is very important.
So even though your employees are sort of working remotely, they're able to really do that hand-holding, sort of step-by-step interaction with the customers.
Yes, yeah.
Very, very impressive. So how do the services then that are provided by a company like Echo contribute to making your shipper supply chains more resilient?
Well, right now, if you've been to the grocery store lately, you need a supply chain to get it restocked. And so, I think, and I just feel fortunate to work in this industry, because I look at some of my friends that are in other lines of work, and, their revenue and their businesses is off 50%, 80%. If you happen to be in the restaurant industry, it could be off 100%. And for us, I think transportation supply chain, is an essential service for our economy, and the flow of goods, maybe not all goods, but the flow of essential goods, it's hard to stop that, and as long as we can participate in the flow of those essential goods, it's a viable business. And I think we're adding a lot of value both to the shippers that are sending those products and to the receivers that are buying them. And you know, I was watching the special last night on TV where they had all the musicians
Oh yeah,
playing
with
music,
Elton John.
and they did a short segment where they were interviewing the truck drivers, you know, and
Yeah.
it's the lonely job, but those guys are out there making it all happen, and you know, we're a little bit of a piece of that equation.
So this is a tough question, Doug. How long do you think the current situation can continue before your customers experience serious economic and financial hardship?
I think some of our customers are experiencing it now. You know, if you happen to sell a product that's so-called non-essential, maybe you manufacture kitchen counters, right? And I venture to guess that at this moment in time, there's not a lot of people that are deciding to remodel their kitchen. so your sales virtually go to zero, and you're not shipping any product. I'm familiar with another company that I'm on the board of, and you know, it's a tough time for them because you know, there's nobody driving cars, and their business depends on cars and traffic, and so I think that's what's interesting about this is that there are some industries like transportation and logistics that are relatively good. There's other industries that are literally shut down. And when you start taking those businesses and the multiplier effect of all that revenue and wages that are paid in those businesses, it's going to have a dramatic impact on our economy. So I'm very concerned that this is going to have a lasting impact. And of course, the CARES Act that the government just funded, I think, was an aggressive step that will help infuse liquidity into our economy. And it was probably the right action, because if you think about how much cash and of that multiplier effect is being pulled out of the economy as we speak, there's got to be something offsetting it. So I think it's a frightening time, and it's a big concern, and yet I think if we all pull together and with that government assistance and helping one another, you know, we'll make the best of it. I was looking at some Goldman Sachs research this morning that thinks that the immediate recession that we find ourselves in will be in recovery mode in the second half of the year. So the United States is always very resilient, but right now it's tough, and depending on your industry, it can be more tough than others.
So Doug, I want to go back to that point earlier about the difficulty of finding trucks in some lanes and drivers and so on. Clearly, in your model, you know, as a non-asset based carrier, essentially, how are you working with the asset-based carriers, those who actually, you know, own and are operating the trucks? Are they more collaborative during this period, or is it more of a competitive kind of situation?
They're collaborative because they, you know, we find that the carriers, they want to find loads that work for them, that reposition their drivers where they want to go, and they want to get the right amount of revenue that makes it worth their while. And we have a variety of ways that we interact with the carriers. In some cases, we talk to them on the phone. In other cases, they use our technology and they peruse our available loads, and they pick up the ones that work for them and they make bids on them. So it's really kind of playing in our marketplace. In other cases, they just tell us where they have empty trucks, and we catalog that inventory and try to remarket it to our shippers. So we've seen in the recent couple of weeks that the demand has ticked up slightly for truckload capacity, and so is the price. And so we're in a situation, I think, in the market right now where you know, rates are a little bit elevated. It's a little bit difficult to find a truck in some lanes, but it's not real tight yet like it was back in 2018. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Doug. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
Well, you know, it's a tough time, I think, for America, but I no place I'd rather be than in America, and I think we're a very resilient economy, and you know, I talked to a lot of customers. I've talked to a lot of CEOs in our industry over the last couple of weeks, and everybody's got a good attitude. I think everybody believes we're going to get through this, and we just got to be safe and flatten the curve, as they say, and then get back to business. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Doug, for making time available for us today, and also for all the good work that you and your team have been doing in keeping toilet paper on store shelves, as well as food and all these other essential goods for us. So thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Hani.
Okay, so thank you for your attention, those who have stayed with us. I'm sure you found the information that we received to be very important and informative at this point. So we do have time for a few questions. I know several of you have been asking questions through the Q&A. We do apologize for some of the technical difficulties that we experienced at the beginning with the sound, and then the hacking that occurred during the screening. My son actually tells me that there are websites where links are posted to such events, and people who are apparently bored at home have been doing this sort of thing. So for the next one, which should be next week, we will be disabling some of these capabilities. We'll become more savvy at combating hacking attempts. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Brett Johnson, our Associate Director, to ask some of the questions he has been monitoring for us.
Hi, hopefully everyone can hear me. The first question we have comes from Jerry Quant, who is the director of the Illinois Autonomous Vehicle Association. And this is his question. Technology exists today to provide increased visibility, data access, for example, to supply chain information across participants via marketplaces and things like that. Due to COVID, supply chain disruptions have increased. Are we seeing interest among these companies, manufacturers, suppliers, shippers, logistics organizations to make this innovation a higher priority both today in the midst of the crisis, as well as when we emerge from this crisis?
So I'm pleased that we have with us two of our panelists. We have Doug Wagner and we have Professor Chopra. So that question, Doug, seems to be directed to you with all the technology that your company has been leading with.
Well, I'm not sure if I understood the question to be, are companies more receptive to autonomous vehicles or just technology in general? My experience is I probably get 30 or 40 emails a day from technology vendors and consultants, and my reaction in this moment is, are you kidding me? You're like, my head's down fighting fires and trying to keep the wheels on. We're not initiating new initiatives at this moment in time. So I think it's been too little time that's elapsed since the onset of this crisis for people to start thinking outside of the box and looking too far down the road. I think most people like myself are in firefighting mode right now, running their businesses, looking at their cash, looking at their AR and AP spreads. But I think when we get through this crisis and look back on it, I think all that's up for grabs. I think everything that smooths out the supply chain, that increases visibility, predictability, is definitely on the table.
Thank you, Doug. Sunil, do you want to address that question as well?
I'm sorry, I just jumped in a few moments ago. So
we'll give you the next one. We'll give you the next one.
Thank you. Thank
All
you.
right. Brett, do you want to read that anonymous comment that you received? I think that's a good one for Sunil to comment on.
Yeah, hang on. Here we go. So from, we're not sure who asked this question, but Question is, from a planning standpoint, in this situation that was not on anyone's radar during the last year's planning cycle, isn't estimating mask, PPE, glove, ventilator inventory, kind of like building a church for Easter Sunday. It seems like we're ignoring the fact that everyone, all countries, 150 plus, are all currently looking for the same healthcare items.
That's absolutely true. I think, the point which the questioner raises about using a storehouse of inventory to deal with a situation like this is unrealistic. The world is not going to keep hundreds of warehouses full of PPE equipment just in case there is a problem. In fact, the US has a strategic reserve, which from what I've been reading, we've already run out of. But I think the important thing to think about is there are two different ways of dealing with a disruption like this. One is to carry tons of inventory, but another one is to pre-arrange for alternative sources of supply. I think where most governments, in my opinion, have missed the boat is in pre-arranging sources of supply. We should, in fact, in anticipation of things like this, not build inventory, but actually have who is going to pick up the supply when it comes up in an emergency. And we should, in fact, be paying them a premium because they're offering us an insurance. We should be paying them a premium in advance in all the years when we don't need it, so that when we do, they will quickly reconfigure their supply chains to provide us with the product that we need. So I agree with the questioner that the solution in this case is not to build tons of inventory and hold it just in case, but to pre-arrange who in the supply chain is going to be the reserve capacity that comes online when needed.
Thank you, Sunil. Brett, you had another question, I believe, on sourcing as well, and China in particular.
Yeah, let me answer, let me read that one, but before I read it, I'll just reiterate to the rest of our attendees, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box and let us know who you are and type your question and we'll try to get it in.
So there are, I believe, also some raised hands here that I could see, but I believe Joan may be monitoring those.
Okay, so we have a question from David Geyer, and he asks, aren't we getting precious earth elements and farm products from China? So if we're in a political spat trade war with China, and on top of that, blaming them for the COVID crisis, what alternatives have we other than starting to bringing back these to the United States? I mean, bringing back the manufacturing of these to the United States.
Yeah, so leaving aside the political dimension of this, which we're not going to get into, certainly from a supply chain perspective and from a business perspective, we are going to be seeing, and as we have already started seeing, more onshoring, but also the point that Professor Chopra made about diversifying, different sources and having alternatives in place. And I suspect we will see a lot more of that going forward. But I will turn it over to Professor Chopra for any additional comment he might wish to offer.
I think, Hani, you really answered the question succinctly. I think the important thing is to ensure that we have alternatives set up. And if onshoring is the right alternative, that's a great alternative to have, but that need not always be the case.
Part of the issue is what we find is maybe in the immediate aftermath, we will find more onshoring, but over time, price becomes the dominant factor. And we see again that concentration with a single supplier or a single source.
And here is where, if I may just jump in, this is something we have seen several times over the last 20 years. Right after a disruption, people are very receptive to the idea that having an alternative is like buying insurance. And, I buy health insurance, but I don't want to have a heart attack every year. I'm very happy if I never go to the hospital. However, in a supply chain, I think the problem is when we buy insurance in terms of alternate supply and don't use it for 1 year, then our CFO comes asking, why are we spending that money and not using it? we need to understand that given disruptions, alternative supply is a form of insurance which is worth paying on an ongoing basis, for which we save big when there is an actual disruption.
Thank you. Doug, do you care to comment on this point as well?
No, I think you guys have it covered. It's above my pay grade.
Thank you. Brett, do you have any other questions from our audience?
There's a very kind of wide scoping question, which any one of us can answer, I suppose, is how has COVID-19 affected your life so far? I don't know, but maybe we could apply that to some other insights, particularly, I don't know, in general, maybe from Doug and Operating Echo or otherwise.
Well, it's affected my life. I tested positive for the Corona-19 virus, so I've spent the last 14 days in quarantine and recovering from that. It was a mild case of symptoms, so I feel fortunate for that. I also feel fortunate that I can't infect anybody now, and I also hopefully have immunity. But so that was one impact. And then just running a business, you know, it's tough when you have this much uncertainty and you see people struggling that you know, a lot of people getting laid off from their jobs. So I think it's a tough time just from a human standpoint, from a lot of the people that I've dealt with, a lot of fear and uncertainty. And that definitely has an impact on me and the people that I care about.
Doug, this is, we very much appreciate your sharing this information. And I think it's good for people to hear that this is, it's here and now, and it could affect anybody. And also, as one gets it, that one is also able to overcome that and continue to, you know, to manage their business. And hopefully now, again, as you mentioned, that immunity, I think that's a bonus. So that's good to hear. Any final thoughts for us, Doug? Again, I appreciated the comments you gave in the interview, and as you are, but that was 2 days ago, and how have things changed very much in the past 2 days from the standpoint of the trucking industry and the kind of transportation services that your company is so good at providing?
Yeah, I think that last week was the end of the month, end of the quarter, and most transportation companies experienced pretty good volume. There seems to be an air of uncertainty about, you know, is the start of the second quarter going to stay as robust as the end of the first quarter? So I think, you know, we're all hoping for the best, but we're planning for the worst. You know, we're hoping that the volumes stay up where they are. And then I think, just again, back on a human note, we've all got to do our part, right? So whether it's, you know, buying some takeout from the restaurant that's struggling and giving a good tip to the guy that delivers it, or bringing some groceries to somebody that's sick and can't leave their house and leaving them on their doorstep. I think now's the time where everybody has to chip in and do their part, and we'll get this economy and this country back on its feet again.
Thank you, Doug. Very wise words. Sunil, any final thoughts for us?
You know, I think this is, you know, as Doug said, it's a difficult time. And as long as each of us keeps, and, you know, my concern is that we are entering the hardest phase. So just maintaining the points that Doug made becomes even more important through April, because my concern is April is likely to be more difficult than March for everybody.
Okay, well, thank you again. Please stay well. And to our audience, to those who have stayed with us, thank you very much for participating in this first roundtable. We will be back again next week with another one of these. There will be, in fact, a series of 6 that we're trying to work on. So you should be receiving information on that. Monitor your emails or come to our website. And thank you again. And thank you to Joan Pinnell and Brett Johnson for all their help in making this event possible today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Thanks.